Hello everyone, welcome back to Dan's Chess Lounge. The Gashimov Memorial is getting ready to start on April 18th, but I decided to do a video today to talk about who the tournament is actually named after. It's named after Vugar Gashimov. Now, he was an Azerbaijani chess player, and he was a very strong player. His peak rating was number 6 in the world. He specialized in playing Blitz as well. That was one of his strong suits, was Blitz chess. His style, very dynamic, bold, I would even say fearless on the chessboard. He kind of revived an opening called the modern Benoni. And I know you guys are familiar with the Benoni, but he had a specialty called the snake Benoni. And that's where the dark squared bishop swings all the way to the queen side of the board. It's a very interesting opening, and you have to know what you're doing to play it, but he was brilliant at it. So today, we'll actually look at one of the games that he played with the snake Benoni. As far as what he liked football, he liked table tennis, and he liked to play a game of pool. His favorite movies was Jackie Chan movies, believe it or not. So, in honor of him, they started this tournament called the Gashimov Memorial, and they erected a big statue in the front. And this tournament brings out a lot of super GMs. Like you'll get Sergei Karyakin. In the past, Boris Gelfand has played. Levon Aronian. So this year, I'm definitely looking forward to see Anish Giri and Magnus Carlsen face off and see what that dynamic is going to be like, considering they had the big blow up on Twitter a few weeks ago. Let's see what the dynamic is going to be like over the chessboard. So we're going to get a lot of great games from a lot of super GMs. I'm looking forward to it. But today, let's go ahead and get into this game here. The game is between Anton Korobov against Vugar Gashimov, and it was held at the European Blitz Championship in Warsaw, Poland. Let's go ahead and see what transpired over the board. Okay, so white started off with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3. Now here, black can play like a Nimzo Indian with bishop b4, or black can also play like a Queen's Indian defense. The idea of fianchettoing the light square bishop there. But as we know, Gashimov was a Benoni practitioner. So he wanted to steer the game into a modern Benoni. So he played c5 here. d5 push is the book move here. That way the center is not opened up and destroyed early. E takes d5. C takes d5. And now you have his pet move here, bishop d6. This is the start of the snake Benoni. And the reason why it's called the snake Benoni is because the bishop kind of slithers out around this d pawn here on d7. And it kind of slithers around like a snake would, like this here. It usually goes to c7, and then a lot of times it bounces to a5. So it's kind of like a snake movement. So, but it's interesting. I mean, how often do you see a structure like this? Knight f3, castles, e4, and it's threatening to fork the bishop and knight there. So you have rook e8, bishop d3, developing move. The bishop goes to c7. Get ready to see a d6 here pretty soon. Castles, d6. So one thing I wanted to say about the snake Benoni is that you really have to play this a few times and be comfortable with it and kind of learn where this dark square bishop should go, where it's going to be useful at. Because for the layperson, you know, it's a lot easier to play a modern Benoni when the bishop is over here on g7 and it's eyeing this long diagonal here. So when the bishop is over here on c7, it doesn't look that great over here. So you really have to know what you're doing. You know, if you want to play a snake Benoni, you have to do some research first, definitely, and look at a lot of games actually. h3, this keeps the knight and bishop off of the g4 square. a6, this is preparing to play b5 here because black wants to push on the queen side and play in the queen side. But white is going to play in the middle and even a lot of times play on the king side. a4, this tries to stop black's expansion ideas. Now you have knight b d7. Bishop f4, this attacks this pawn here. A lot of times in the Benoni, the d pawn will be a weakness and will be a target. So this is a perk of having this bishop here on c7, that it actually reinforces the protection of this d pawn here. Knight f8, getting ready to reroute to g6. Rook e1, knight g6, hits the bishop. Bishop retreats back. Now you have rook b8. So black can continue with his advances on the queen side. Knight d2. Knight e5 hits the bishop. Bishop retreats to f1. Bishop d7. Black is really eyeing his queenside expansion here. He says, I'm going to get it in no matter what. f4, you have a strike in the center that pushes the knight off of that good square there, that good outpost. Knight goes back to g6. King goes to h1. b5. A takes b, a takes b. So now black is pushing forward with his queenside expansion. b3 here. This kind of stops black from playing b4 and then being able to stick that dark square bishop on this nice diagonal here. And that was also one of the reasons why the king moved over to h1, is to get off of this diagonal and also just to tuck his king into a more safer square, because things can get very active and the king can get caught up in some crossfire here. Bishop a5. So since white kind of stopped black from playing c4 right now, the bishop still goes to a5 and gets on a much better diagonal than just being stuck here on c7. Hits the knight undefended, so it's reinforced with rook c1, bishop b4. If the pawn is pushed, then the bishop can even go back to c5 there. You have bishop d3, queen a5, put another attacker onto that c3 square that the knight is on. So then white protects it with knight db1. Even though it's a protecting move and it's a useful move here, it's still, I never like to see my pieces go all the way back to the home square, to the back rank. c4, and the knight is relocating to b1. That allows black to get in the c4 move and continue with his queenside surge. B takes c, b takes c. And now, can white capture this pawn here on c4? What would happen if white captured the pawn here? Actually, there's nothing bad that would happen to white for taking that pawn. One continuation would be bishop a4 here, hits the queen, and the queen goes to d4, and white is perfectly fine. He's a pawn up here. Another continuation might be rook bc8, hits the bishop, and again, this time white goes to d3, and white is perfectly fine. So white could have taken the pawn here on c4, but he didn't do that. Instead, he chose to retreat back to f1. Black plays h6, e5, and now the knight retreats to h7. So now we see the point of black playing h6 here a move ago. e6, white is continuing with his charge in the center. F takes e, d takes e, and now can black capture this pawn on e6? What would happen? If bishop takes, then you have rook takes, and now bishop takes c4, pinning the rook to the king here. Knight g f8, bishop takes, knight takes, and the material is actually even here, but black is going to have a hard time maintaining this d6 pawn. This d pawn is going to fall at some point because it's all isolated by itself, and it's going to be a lot of pressure on the d pawn. So it would just be a tough continuation for black. So he doesn't take. Instead of taking the pawn here on e6, he plays bishop c6, putting the bishop on a beautiful diagonal. This is actually called, if I can draw my arrow straight, this is called the long diagonal. Bishop takes c4. White grabs that pawn that was on c4. Knight f6. So black gave up that pawn there in order to get his knight in a more active position. White retreats back to f1. Now you have queen f5. And just in those two moves there, white moved the same piece. He moved his bishop to capture the pawn, then he moved the same bishop back to f1 to play defense. And black has a lot of threats here. He's threatening the e6 pawn. He's threatening to win the f4 pawn. And he's actually threatening to win the h3 pawn because the bishop is pinning this g2 pawn. So black is threatening to play queen takes h3. And that would be very devastating. Which pawn does white defend? It's not an easy decision to make. So he plays queen d2. Now you have knight h4, adding more pressure on this pinned pawn. Rook e3. This attempts to hold the h3 pawn. Rook captures the pawn on e6. Rook captures, queen captures, and now you have queen d3, which is trying to protect that pawn still on h3, because this bishop is doing a great job here pinning the king here. And white would love to trade off the queens at this point. If white can go ahead and play queen c4 and force a queen trade, that would be what white would want. So the king moves over to h8. That stops any forced queen trades. Knight e2. The knight's going back to try to play defense. Now you have bishop e4. It hits the queen. The queen goes to a6. That is not a good move. The queen goes all the way to the other side of the board where he left the defense of his king side. He went all the way to the extreme side of the board where there's nothing going on. So black punishes white with queen takes h3. Yes. And Korobov actually resigned at this point because there's no way to stop an eventual checkmate on g2 without giving up the queen. There's 3 attackers on this g2 square, and there's only 2 defenders. Play might have continued with queen d3. That was the best try, but then that loses the queen immediately to bishop takes g2 check. Now, after the king moves, the queen falls off the board. So that was a great game by Gashimov. He showed his masterful ideas in the modern Benoni, the snake Benoni. Unfortunately, Vugar Gashimov passed away in 2014 from complications from a brain tumor. He had been struggling and treating that tumor for about 1.5 years at that point. But his legacy will live on through this tournament, the Gashimov Memorial Tournament, and his legacy will live on through all of his games that he's played, and he will be forever remembered in chess. And he'll also be remembered for helping to revive the modern Benoni and bring that back to grandmaster level chess. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed the video today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.